You know, industrial agriculture, the Green Revolution, was established based on a series of assumptions that are not valid today anymore. First of all, they talked about an agriculture that was going to count on unlimited energy and cheap petroleum, that the climate would be stable and there would be abundant water, that nature could be controlled with technology, and that hunger will be solved by increasing production. I think many of the previous speakers already have addressed some of these issues that say that this is not the truth. We have about 1.5 billion hectares of agriculture worldwide. 80% of that is actually monocultures that are high input, high energy systems that are highly degrading, and that they have a huge ecological footprint. Many years ago, the National Academy of Sciences came out with a report about the dangers of genetic homogeneity, because that would create vulnerability of our crop systems to pests and diseases, and we could add today that it also would add vulnerability to climate change. So this is happening today in the United States. You can see, for example, that in July 24th, at the worst time of the drought, there were huge losses in corn production because of these monocultures lack resiliency. They lack ecological mechanisms, they lack organic matter, they lack genetic diversity and species diversity, and therefore they're very vulnerable to extreme climatic events. But they're not only vulnerable to climatic events. Because of their dependence on petroleum, you can see that food prices go up. The inputs go up because petroleum prices go up. So here you can see fertilizer price, you can see farm machinery, fuel expenses go up, and as this petroleum goes up in price, the more expensive are the inputs in which these farming systems depend. And the more inputs we put into the systems, the less yields there is. There is a law of diminishing returns to a point where you can see now that the yields are actually decreasing. They're not increasing in modern agricultural systems. And these systems are addicted to pesticides, and pesticides create more pest problems because there is a treadmill created by the evolution of resistance. Here you can see more than 500 arthropod species that are dependent that are resistant to different insecticides. You have also weeds that are becoming more and more resistant now with the Roundup Ready soybean, and you have diseases that are becoming resistant. So this illusion that we can control nature doesn't really work. On top of that, this agriculture is responsible to producing about 20% to 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing climate change. So methane and nitrous oxides and CO2 are all basically emissions of industrial agriculture, which is interesting because it's a paradox. The more they emit, the more vulnerable this agriculture is, the more it collapses. And at the same time, we can see that their emissions and all the uses of all the pesticides and other inputs create huge health problems, environmental problems. So the cost of food at the checkout corner is much higher than we're really paying. There is cheap food policies in this country. That's why we're paying so little price for the food. But if we accounted for the externalities, it's about $300 per acre if all these externalities were accounted for. For the food, that is not that good. This is the food that we're eating in industrial societies. The footprint of these diets are huge. And on top of that, we all learn in school that this is the pyramid of food that we should be eating. A lot of vegetables, a lot of grains, and some meat and some dairy, but it turns out that all the subsidies go to on the other way around. It basically, the subsidy of meat and dairy, the subsidy of grains is much lower. About 61% of the $21 million in subsidies that go into agriculture in this country go to 10% of the largest farmers, and most of them are big cattle ranchers and dairy producers. Sander Postel talked about the addiction to water. You can see that diet based on meat is also highly dependent on water. 15,000 liters of water per kilo of beef as opposed to 1,000 for a kilo of apples. Also, the problem of hunger doesn't have anything to do with production. That was the Malthusian view of the Green Revolution, that people were starving because food production was not catching up with the production of food. And it turns out that we have enough food today in the world to feed 9 billion people. So the question that this this conference is asking about whether we're going to feed them in 2025. We can feed them today. As a matter of fact, actually, the amount of grain that is going to feed cattle in the CAFOs could feed right now 3.5 billion people. And we only have 1 billion people that are starving. On top of that, we're throwing away, especially in the United States and Europe, 1.3 billion tons of food per year, enough to feed the whole African continent. And on top of that, the causes of hunger don't have anything to do with scarcity. So there are some proximate causes. For example, climate change, increased consumption of meat in China and India, high cost of petroleum, and then diversion of land to biofuels. All that is true. But the real causes of the hunger in the world has to do that the food system is controlled by a bunch of multinational corporations. As food prices go up, as Sandra Postel was saying, the profits of the multinationals go up, because the prices are not just going up because of problems of water cost or petroleum cost. They're going up because of speculation that these corporations are using and actually are marketing food in Wall Street, just like any other commodity. And on top of that, there's a conglomerate of multinationals now that are controlling the food system. It's not just the food companies anymore, the biotechnology companies. Now you have the petroleum companies, the car companies. Why? Because they're involved in the production of biomass. They're not interested in producing food. They're interested in producing biomass, biofuels, bioplastics, biopharma crops. And the reason why there is so much interest in biofuels, especially in the United States and in Europe, is because the United States and Europe consume 50% of the energy in the world. And the rest of the countries, which is 170, consume the rest. So they need to change their energy matrix because they don't like to be dependent on countries that, like Iran or Venezuela, that are not very friendly to the US. But the problem is, where are they going to get the land to produce the biofuels? If all the corn and soybean of this country would be devoted to produce biofuels, ethanol and biodiesel, only 16% of the needs of the United States of energy would be met. So you have to go and find land somewhere else. So where is the land available? In Africa and in South America. And how is this being, the expansion of these food crops, of these world energy crops, such as maize, sugarcane, soybeans, palm oil, how is it going to be, how are they going to access this land? Not only the United States, but also China and other countries, through a process of land grabbing. Basically, there's a huge process of land grabbing going on in Africa. More than 140 million acres have been grabbed already, 75% in the sub-Saharan Africa. This is not to grow food for the Africans. This is to grow biofuels for these countries that are dependent and they want to change their energy matrix for biofuels. And then transgenic crops. You hear the multinationals, for example, in California, the GMO labeling lost because the multinationals, 6 multinationals, were investing $1 million a day against the proposition. Why would they be so worried if it's just labeling? Well, it turns out that the propaganda says that there are 180 million hectares of transgenic crops that exist right now are feeding the world. Well, it turns out that the dominant crops are 4: corn, soybean, cotton, and canola. Corn and soybean go basically to feed cattle and cars. So there's not 1 hectare of the transgenic crops in the world today that is feeding one of the hungry people, the 1 billion hungry people in the world. And then the rest is cotton. Nobody eats cotton. And canola, maybe the Canadians put it in their salad. So this is the previous speaker was talking about food deserts. This is what transgenic crops create. This is the legacy of transgenics in southern Brazil, in Paraguay, in Argentina. Food deserts. These are food deserts. Not only they erode the soil and contaminate the waterways, but they also just grow soybean, which doesn't even stay in the country. They go to China. Okay, China already bought all the production of soybean from Brazil and Argentina until the year 2015. Because they're eating more meat, okay? And these food deserts basically displace small farmers also. And the only ones that are resisting this are the small farmers themselves. So you have a community in Paraguay that is surrounded by soybean, transgenic soybean, and they are resisting to sell their land. And they are the only ones producing food in the radius of 300 kilometers. So we need to change our agriculture. Everybody has been saying that, the previous speakers too. Food production must increase, but we're going to have less land, We're going to have less water, less petroleum, less nitrogen. We're going to have in a scenario of climate change and social unrest. And these challenges cannot be met with the industrial approach and biotechnology. We need a new approach which we call agroecology. So what is agroecology? It's a science that promotes an agriculture that is going to be for the future, that is decoupled from petroleum, that is that with agroecosystems of low environmental impact, that are resilient to climate change, that are multifunctional, that they provide ecosystem, social, cultural, economic services, and they are the foundation for local food systems, not for global food systems. Agroecosystem diversity, high productivity, high efficient, low external inputs, a lot of interactions between crop and livestock for high recycling and high efficiency rates. That little flag is Cuba. What happened in Cuba in 1989? Cuba was highly dependent from the Soviet Union on an industrial agriculture that was actually more mechanized and used more chemicals than the United States. But what happened was that when the Soviet bloc collapsed, the imports of petroleum, pesticides, fertilizers dropped in 80%. Can you imagine that we turn off tomorrow in New Mexico or in California the petroleum in 80%? What would happen? The whole system would collapse. Well, what happened in Cuba is that the organic agriculture took off. The reason is that the country has a very special social organization system, but in addition to that, it has 2% of the Latin American population, but 11% of the scientists. So they have a lot of human capital because the revolution invested a lot in education. And so there was the need for a transition of the agricultural model from a conventional agricultural system that depended on inputs, monocultures, et cetera, to a sustainable system based on agroecological approaches. And how did they do that? Since they didn't have inputs, so they didn't have transportation. Basically what they started was a movement called Campesino, farmer-to-farmer network, in which you can see in 1999, right after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, there were only 216 farmers, small farmers, using agroecology. Today there's 110,000. It's an horizontal exchange of information that goes very quickly. So they use agroecological strategies like organic amendments and polycultures and green manure, cover crops, et cetera, and this is the most sophisticated machinery you're going to find. And there's a tremendous amount of innovation on compost teas and compost that basically use the litter from the forest as the source of microorganisms that is inoculated into this material. So here you have one example. This is Fernandito, a farmer that produces about 14 different vegetable crops. The land equivalent ratio is 1.76. That means that he would need 76% more land if he was just growing monocultures. He obtains much more production in polyculture than in 1 hectare of polyculture. He obtained the same productivity than 1.76 hectares of monoculture. But how much food has he produced? He can feed with 1 hectare, the production of 1 hectare, 21 people with energy and 12.5 people with protein with an energy efficiency of 11.2. That means you put 1 kilocalorie and you get 11 back. This family is even more dramatically efficient because they incorporate animals, and also they have a lot of diversity in their systems and rotational systems. And Casimiro produces enough protein to feed 34 persons with the production of 1 hectare with an energy efficiency of 30. 1 kilocalorie, he gets 30. You know what's the efficiency of industrial agriculture in average in the United States? 1.5. So this is 20 times more efficient in terms of energy use, and obviously the footprint is much less. And you can see that the productivity, that black bar is after the breakdown of the productivity of different crops after the breakdown of the Soviet bloc. Before they used to have fertilizers, and now they're producing more food without fertilizers, as you can see there. There are other countries like Brazil. Brazil, there's an explosion of agroecology going on. All those yellow dots is agroecological experiences that are being dispersed, not only by the social movements and also the NGOs, but the government has policies to support the small farmers. They have a national law of organic agriculture and agroecology, and they have a small farm ministry of agriculture. They have a ministry of agriculture that is the big one for the soybean people, and they have one for the 4.8 million family farmers that are producing 70% of the food in 20% of the land. And they have a lot of experiences. They do no-till agriculture without herbicides, like I was saying this morning. They use a cocktail of cover crops. Then they pass what is called a roll of vaca. Instead of putting the cattle on, like our farmer did, they pass a tree trunk that basically lives as a mulch. Then they come in, this mulch is going to start decomposing, and it's going to start releasing some chemicals into the soil. Then they plant with a no-till, with animal traction, corn and beans, as you can see there, and there's no emergence of weeds. The crops emerge, but the weeds don't. Why? Well, basically what happens, this is what happens when Monsanto doesn't want me to talk about this. Next. They don't like this because they cannot sell their herbicide, because it's a natural herbicide. You see, the mulch produces these allelochemical compounds that concentrate in the first 2 centimeters of the soil. That's where 99% of the wheat seed bank is, and there's no emergence of weeds. So they figure it out very quickly, the farmers, through their innovation, that if they planted deeper than the toxic layer, then the crop would come out free of that toxicity. So who is feeding us today? That's the question. 50% of the food that we eat today comes from the small farmers. Only 30% comes from industrial agriculture. And how many small farmers are there in the world? Well, there's about 350 million farms that are managed by about 1.5 billion small farmers throughout the world, including small farmers in the United States. And these people have come up with 1.9 million crop varieties that they have developed and that they still conserve. The Green Revolution only came out with 8,000 varieties. 8,000 varieties of crops, with all the support from the World Bank and FAO and et cetera, the whole consultative group of international agricultural research people with more than 30 years of research going on. 8,000 varieties. The peasants have developed 1.9 million. And we know only 25% of the potential of this genetic diversity that they have. So they grow their crops in polycultures. This is nothing new to small farmers. They have been doing agriculture for 5,000 years. There's a lot of synergies in the system I don't have time to go into. But one of the things is that they overyield because they use the resources more efficiently, the water, the nutrients, the sunlight, and so on. So when they obtain 1.5, that means that they produce 50% more than the same area of a monoculture, with less pesticides and so on. So agroecology then, what it does, it uses the elements of modern science, but at the same time uses traditional knowledge and creates a dialogue of wisdom, like a marriage, in which we're respecting each other because their cosmovision is as valid as us. You see, in Latin America there's 500 ethnic groups, and there's therefore 501 ways of looking at the world. Who said that our Western mode of looking at the world was the only valid one? So the 500 cosmovisions that exist out there are as valid as the one that we have. And the one that we have, when I say we, is the academia, the Occidental academia, is not really giving us many alternatives for the crisis that we're facing. So, for example, there has been a lot of recovery of the terraces in the Andes, in Peru. There's more than 2,000 terraces that have hectares of terraces that have been recovered using, for example, lupin, which is a species of a legume that grows in the Andes. And you can see that the productivity when you use the agroecological system with lupin is about 9.9. That would be your net income per invested peso. But the energy efficiency again is 30.5 compared to the modern HAIP that would be only 4.8. There's also recovery of these systems that are amazing, about 3,800 meters above sea level, the waru-warus, which actually allow the production of crops because the water absorbs the heat during the day and releases it at night, changing the microclimate in about 2 degrees and therefore offset the frost. And there's now a recovery of about 4,700 hectares that are being recovered by the peasants and the social movements, because these are the systems that existed 3,000 years ago and are the ones that are going to get us out of the crisis today. And there's a lot of seed saving in Latin America. In Nicaragua alone, there's 35,000 families that have recovered more than 129 local varieties of maize and 144 of beans in about 14,000 hectares. And they exchange the seeds between them, but they also understand why they need to protect their seeds and why others are interested in their seeds. because there's a lot of biopiracy going on around, especially from some multinational corporations that are promoting biotechnology. One of the challenges in Latin America and in many countries in the third world is also hillside agriculture. I mean, these farmers should never be farming there, but what happens is that Chiquita Banana took over the valleys. So what the solution would be land reform, but obviously land reform is a political process that doesn't happen in many countries. So there's a lot of efforts going on stabilizing productivity in hillsides. Mucuna, for example, which is a legume that has spread like fire in Central America, where farmers grow it as a green manure, then they slash it, then they plant their crops in there. And you can see that in Central America, there is about 45,000 families that benefited from mucuna, increasing their yields, tripling their yields of corn without any inputs in hillside situations. There's also restoration. Some farmer was talking about restoration. Well, this is La Mixteca in Oaxaca in Mexico, where farmers, because of historical processes of deforestation and overgrazing and so on, were displaced from their lands. And then some farmers stayed there. And they started reforesting the hillsides, especially the tops of the mountains, because they say that that's the sponge of the mountain. Then soil conservation practices, then water harvesting, and then introduction of crops like corn, but also amaranthus, which is very rich in amino acids and protein, and it's a crop that is ancient in their culture that was lost. So we're seeing then that climate change is happening. There's a lot of natural disasters that are happening at a much faster rate than before. And there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from traditional systems. For example, in the case of coffee, there is a tendency now to take away the shade of coffee in most of the Latin American countries because that provides more productivity because of the big demand of coffee that is coming from the north. And what happens next is that when you take the shade, not only you take out all the biodiversity and the ecological services, but actually the systems become more vulnerable to climate change. Why? Because you can see the evapotranspiration in the low shade system is much higher than in the high shade systems. So this is a system that keeps the microclimate. That equation that Sandra that showed, the water balance is much more optimal in the highly shaded systems. So the problem is, okay, they're going to produce more, but then because there's more markets and so on, but when the climate change, when the drought comes, then what are they going to do? The same thing happened with a lot of farmers that were introduced with improved pastures. There's a huge program of improved pastures in Latin America with all kinds of grasses that were promoted that responded very well to nitrogen and water. But then when there's no water, this is what happens. And this is what happens with their cattle. Losses of 250,000, for example, cattle in Colombia in a recent drought. And the only systems that survive in that area are the silvopastoral systems that are being promoted by NGOs and small farmers that, again, conserve water because it enriches organic matter and soil biological activity, the microclimatic effect, the less evapotranspiration, and so on. And there's a lot of studies that have been done after hurricanes. Now hurricanes are coming very much more often, and unfortunately they go through Cuba, they go through Central America, also come through the United States. And the studies that were done after Mitch, for example, in Central America, in Nicaragua, and in Honduras, and in Guatemala, show that the systems, that the farmers that had monoculture suffered more mudslides, as opposed to the farmers that had agroforestry systems, soil conservation practices. And you can see next that in Honduras, where it was the worst impact, the resistance of the agroecological system was much higher, much less mudslides. And in Cuba, in 2008, there were 3 hurricanes, not just 1, 3. And the only systems that survived were these ones. Again, the agroforestry systems or the system that had shelter belts. And there were some studies that showed that the category 2 and 3 farms were the more diverse ones that suffered 60% damage, which is pretty big because there were 3 hurricanes. But the other ones suffered 73%. But the most important thing is that in resiliency, there's 2 components. One is resistant to the impact, and the other one is recovery. Look at number 3, how it recovered very quickly after the impact of the storm. You know, the productivity of the system went up 120 days later. The system was recovering its productivity. So when there's extreme climatic events, the farming system resiliency of these traditional farming systems is basically determined by 3 things. One, the surrounding landscape heterogeneity, what is called the matrix that surrounds the farms, the vegetational complexity of the farms, polycultures, agroforestry, and the soil and water management. That is the soil organic matter, the soil cover, all these things that have been talked before. But there's another element which people talked about this morning also, is the seeds. It turns out that in Mexico and many other countries, there is a lot of varieties that are drought tolerant. So in cases of drought, for example, the maíz de cajete is a system that is used in Oaxaca, where farmers make a cajete. It's like a hole where they plant very deep the seed, and then that seed is able to come up without water. But it's not just the seed, it's also the knowledge that these farmers have. There's a whole cultural diversity have nurtured these agroecosystems. So it's not a matter of transferring the seeds from Mexico to here and see if it works. Because if you don't bring the knowledge, if you don't bring the culture that has nurtured that seed, then there's no possibility of that functioning. Cultural diversity and genetic diversity are linked together. So when we talk about, the reactive capacity of the system, the farmers respond, is all going to depend on their knowledge skills. The more traditional, the more millenary, the better. Their access to resources, their organization, and other aspects. It's not just ecological resiliency, it's also social resiliency. The capability to create networks, for example, of support and solidarity between the farmers. That's another aspect. So how do these innovations then get spread around? It's through the campesino a campesino movement, which is an horizontal process, pedagogical process of exchange of information, of knowledge, and so on and so on. And then there's a need to support these farmers with local markets. So there's a lot of initiatives in certain countries like Brazil, like Venezuela, like Ecuador, where the governments actually provide a space for the farmers to sell their produce, and even they help them to bring it to the markets with the local transportation from the municipality, with a compromise with a commitment that this production is going to be sold to the public cheaper than conventional. This is the only place in the world where organic is cheaper than conventional. And that creates a loyalty between the farmers and the consumers, and there is actually a participatory process of certification. There's a group of farmers and consumers that certify at no cost the farms, and that way, you get away with that, with those regulations and with those costs of certification. But there is also political action. For example, this is a city, a little town in southern Brazil, where the mayor of the city now is an organic farmer. And the first thing he did, the first day, he put a sign, here we produce food without agrotoxics. Now actually, it's without agrotoxics and without transgenics. That sign has been modified. And this farmer, that is a mayor, also said that all the production that the farmers are producing has to be given to feed the schools and the hospitals. But you're not just gonna give the kids just like lettuce and tomatoes. You have to give them cheese and chicken and milk and so on. So they funded agro-industries managed by the farmers to produce these 43,000 lunches per week that they have to produce that go to the schools and the hospitals. And actually, therefore, the farmers now have an assured market that is an institutional market. They don't depend on the globalized economy. They don't have to compete because they're providing a social service. And as a matter of fact, based on this experience, now this Ministry of Agriculture for Small Farmers in Brazil came out with a law that they assure all small farmers to buy 1/3 of the production. The government pays them for 1/3 of the production because that production goes to the social programs. So we have, this is in Spanish, but we're in New Mexico. We have the food empires, the multinationals, that not only control what the producers are producing, what they're going to produce, how they're going to produce, how much they're going to produce, but they're also controlling what the consumers eat. Those guys that go to Safeway or to Walmart, they tell them what they're going to eat, the quality, the price of their food. So they're squeezing the producers and the consumers at the same time. So the idea is to produce a bypass. And that bypass next is the peasant markets. You see, that system will continue existing, but we can create an alternative path that is going to be increasingly becoming more popular as the people realize that small farmers are producing food, healthy food, but also other services. For example, in Brazil, in southern Brazil, in Sao Paulo state, towns that are surrounded by sugarcane are 10 degrees hotter than towns that are surrounded by small farmers. The water quality is better in towns that are surrounded by organic farmers than by conventional farmers. So those are services that people are also receiving from small farmers. This leads me then to the concept of food sovereignty. You see, food security is one concept where people have to have access to food. You know, New Mexico, for example, could be food secure, but it depends on this food from California, New York, I don't know where, okay? What about if tomorrow California doesn't want to sell anymore the food to New Mexico? Food sovereignty means the right to produce your own food and create your own agricultural model, giving priority first to national and local markets. And then, that doesn't mean you're not going to trade, but that's the prerequisite of food sovereignty. But food sovereignty also means that farmers have to have access to land. You see, in this country, we have 1% of the population farming with an average age of farmers of 60 years. Young people don't want to go back to the land, and the few that I saw here cannot go back because of the price of the land. So how are they going to have access to land? In Cuba, for example, right now, the government in the peri-urban areas, 10 kilometers around the big cities like Havana, Santa Clara, are giving away 13 hectares for free to anybody that wants to farm. There's 100,000 petitions of land, 40% from young people. I tell my students in California, what about if tomorrow the government of California gives us free land? Who would take it? Everybody would take it. So there's a problem, there's a structural problem of access to land. And that is a problem not only here, but everywhere. So there has to be access to land, access to water, and access to seeds, because those are human rights. Nobody can own the land or can own the seeds or the water. But at the same time, you have to have state support, political will. The government has to provide research, agroecological research, extension, credit, markets, incentives to the small farmers. But also, they have to have the organized social movements. You see, in Brazil, there's 1 million families that already took over 10 million hectares of land. That's called the landless peasant movement. And then the government now is forced to expropriate that land from the big landowners. Why? Because there's a law in Latin America called the social function of the land. That means the land has to be under production. Cannot be idle, they cannot speculate with it. So these people take over the land, and the government is forced to expropriate it. So we need to discourage industrial scale meat and dairy production. We have to reject agrofuels and biomass and transgenic crops. We have to promote land reform, and we have to encourage urban and peri-urban food production and distribution. I forgot to mention that in Cuba, the last speaker was talking about urban agriculture. In Cuba, there's 50,000 hectares of urban agriculture in the cities that is providing 1/3 of the vegetable and fruit needs of the population with a average productivity of 15 kilos per square meter per year with no inputs, only organic management of the system. But in addition to food sovereignty, we need to reach also energy sovereignty and technological or productive sovereignty within a context of resiliency. What that does mean? Technological sovereignty means what the farmer was talking about this morning, that he's able to manage his system with diversity and local resources without depending on external inputs of any kind. And then energy sovereignty means the ability to produce your energy for your own needs, for your transportation, for your tractors, for your trucks, etc. So next. So for example, here in Brazil, you can see farmers that are intercropping Ricinus communis, castor bean, for biofuel with corn and beans. Next, go into this little machine that basically separates the oil from the rest of the stuff. And then that oil is put directly into the tractors and trucks. And these farmers don't have to buy 1 gallon from Chevron or any of those guys. They produce their own energy without sacrificing food security, food sovereignty, because they are not devoting the land for biofuels, but they're intercropping it with food crops. So just to finalize here, this is a study that was done by Bagley and Perfecto and others in the University of Michigan. They did a study whether organic agriculture with agroecological approaches could or not increase production. And you can see that in the developed countries, when the value is less than 1, it means that there's no potential. And you can see that in most crops, there's no possibility to enhance the yields of of the systems with agroecological methods, but you can see that in developing countries, yes. My interpretation of this is the following. What is the difference between the South and the North in terms of agriculture? One, they have the genetic diversity that is millenary, that is there, 1.9 million varieties in the hands of farmers. Two, the traditional millenary knowledge about managing nature, respecting nature, and all the things that the farmer said this morning, these people have been doing. They call the land Pachamama, okay? The Mother Earth. There's a whole spiritual dimension of the management of land. And third, they have the social organization to promote a political agenda, because this is going to take a lot of struggle in order to change the food system. These people that have control of the food system are not going to give it up just like that. If you give them data about water, or we're going to preserve these birds, or look at the soil, they don't care about that. Here there's going to be a social struggle, not to call it revolution, that is going to be needed to change the food system. It has to start somewhere, and you guys are starting it. Thank you very much.